In this lesson, we'll learn how render proxies can be used as a way of minimizing system resources whenever rendering. Okay, so in this scene, we have a piece of geometry here, and this is actually something that was sculpted in ZBrush. Now the problem is that whenever this geometry is brought into something like Maya, typically the geometry is very, very dense. And in my case, if I were to press 4 on my keyboard to take a look at the wireframe, you can see that the mesh is really quite dense. Now the problem is that whenever trying to render a scene like this, oftentimes Maya will crash. In my case, the scene file alone for this particular scene is over 300 megs in size. And especially on a 32-bit system, trying to open up a scene that is that dense and then trying to render it will typically cause Maya to crash just because there is not enough system resources to open up the scene and render it. So what we can do is utilize a new feature that is introduced in Maya 2009, and this is a feature called Render Proxies. Now basically what this feature will allow us to do is offload the geometry outside of our scene. So what we'll do is basically take a piece of geometry, export it, and then link that geometry to something very, very simple. So that way the high-res geometry is not visible here within the viewport. It will only be called in whenever the render takes place. So what that means is that overall we have a lot less system resources that are being used. We don't have to worry about any sort of overhead about loading this very, very dense geometry into the scene. Again, the geometry will only be used at render time. So the way that this works is we first need to select the geometry that we want to export, and this can be actually several pieces of geometry at once. And let's go up to File, and we'll export Selection, and we'll make sure we take a look inside the options for this. Now what we want to do is in the general options, let's make sure that we have this set to a MentalRay file. And once we have this set, you can see that we actually do have a few output settings to choose from. One is a renderable scene file. We also have the ability to choose from a scene fragment or a render proxy. In this case, we want to use a render proxy. Now once we do this, we can now choose things like whether we want to export materials, material assignments, any incoming shaders. Typically, I like to make sure that these are all turned off, because what I am typically doing is still in the process of making very, very heavy adjustments to the lighting, the materials, things like that. And really, at this point, I still want to be able to have that freedom. So I want to make sure that these are all turned off, so that way I can still come in and make these kinds of adjustments to materials and things. We can also choose whether or not the file that will be output will be a binary or an ASCII file. This is, would be something if you wanted to be able to open up the exported file in something like a text editor and be able to make adjustments to that. Really, as far as which choice you want to go with, the choice is yours. And then we also have a few options to be able to choose from as far as whether or not we want to export any sort of light maps or texture files. Really, the main thing that you want to be aware of is that we are not exporting any sort of materials or shaders or anything like that. So let's make sure we disconnect that. And also, again, making sure that we uncheck the ability to export materials, material assignments, and any incoming shaders. So once we have this done, let's now export this selection. And we can now choose where the file is going to be placed and what it's going to be called. So in our case, let's just call this something like high-res torso. There we are. Export this. Give this just a moment, again, because this is a fairly heavy piece of geometry. And there we go. So you can see it's now output that as a .mi file. And now, all we have to do is really take this piece of geometry and just delete it out of the scene, because really we don't need it at this point. So now becomes the step where we have to now define some sort of a proxy to be able to use this geometry. So in our case, we can use any kind of a proxy object we want. Something like a cube tends to work really well. So in our case, now let's just go back to this cube. And if you take a look inside the shape node for your geometry, you should see a MentalRay pull-down menu. And what we can do is define the render proxy for this piece of geometry. So now let's come in. Let's browse to this piece of geometry. Again, this will be found inside the MentalRay tab. And here's our high-res torso that we just exported. Go ahead and click on that. And once we do this, you'll see that the cube automatically will scale itself in order to fit the position that this original piece of geometry had. So it's very important that if you want to make sure that your geometry comes in exactly as it was, that you don't do any sort of adjustments to this cube as far as actually pulling it, scaling it, doing any sort of adjustments before you plug in this render proxy. All right. So now really it becomes a process of just going through these same procedures for any other piece of geometry you want to export. So in our case, if we were to take this entire gun assembly that was on his arm, we can just take all of this, again, File, Export Selection. We have the metal ray option already selected. Render proxy, again, we'll disconnect any materials that are coming in. Export this selection, we'll call this gun. Give this a moment. And once this is exported, just delete the geometry. Create the cube. Again, we'll leave this exactly where it is. Won't make any sort of adjustments to this. Go into the shape node and go back to your metal ray tab, connect in the gun.mi, and there we are. Now what this means is now that we don't have any sort of overhead with the geometry in our scene, this geometry will only be loaded up at render time, so it makes this scene much easier to manage. So I'm going to go ahead and open up a scene now where we've gone ahead and exported these additional pieces of geometry. And in this case now you can see that much of the geometry has been exported. Now if you recall from earlier in the lesson, the scene file that had the very dense geometry was about 300 megs in size. This scene file by comparison is just a little less than 4 megs in size, so a very significant difference as far as the overhead required to render this. So let's take a look at what we can actually expect to see once we render this scene out. Alright, and once the render is complete, again you can see that even though the geometry is not visible in the viewport, it will actually still pull in that geometry at render time and render with exactly the same materials and any kind of light setup that you would have defined in the scene itself. And again, this scene would have been probably impossible to render if we weren't using some kind of a render proxy for this. Now in my case, you can see that all of these different objects do have the same material, and that's because I did actually assign the same material to all of these. But if we want to override that, all we have to do is just select the proxy object that's responsible, and then just assign whatever new material we want. So in my case, I'm just going to assign a little bit darker material to the body, and I've just assigned that to the proxy, and once I re-render, you can see that that is exactly what we get. So by using these render proxies, really we don't lose any sort of functionality as far as being able to work with different materials, different shaders, light setups, shadows. All the maintained functionality is still there. The only difference is now that the scene is much more stable since we only have to load this geometry at render time. So that's a look at how we can take advantage of these render proxies within Maya.